It arrived before the sound, before the logic, before Sabrina's mind could catch up to what her body already knew, that death was about to bloom in fire and metal just 30 feet from where she stood. The desert evening had been quiet, almost spiritual in its stillness, the kind of silence that settles over Highway 87 when the sun bleeds out across the horizon and the world holds its breath between day and night. Inside the Triple Crown Diner, the air hung thick with the scent of burnt coffee and yesterday's meatloaf, a humble aroma that had become the backdrop of Austin's carefully constructed invisibility. She was a beautiful black woman with eyes that carried stories she'd never tell, her natural elegance impossible to hide even beneath the crisp white shirt now marked with the day's honest labor and the black apron tied with military precision around her waist. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, not a strand out of place, because control over the small things was all she had left. She moved through the diner with a quiet, purposeful grace, refilling salt shakers with a rhythmic motion that kept her hands busy and her mind blessedly empty. Sabrina was the picture of resilience, a woman who had built a fortress around her heart, brick by invisible brick, to survive a past that still whispered her name in nightmares. The diner was nearly empty, save for Rosa, the cook whose weathered hands had been flipping burgers on this same grill for 23 years, and Marcus, a regular whose sun-damaged face told the story of 1,000 highway miles. He nursed his third cup of black coffee, his eyes tracking the vultures circling in the distance. "Gonna be a scorcher tomorrow," Marcus muttered, his voice like gravel shifting in a tin can, breaking the comfortable silence. "You closing up soon?" Austin looked up, offering him a small smile that didn't quite erase the weariness from her features. "You know Mr. Chin wants someone here until 9. Highway traffic doesn't stop just because the sun went down." "Highway traffic," Marcus repeated with a knowing chuckle. "That what we're calling our 3 customers a night now?" But Austin wasn't listening anymore. Something had changed in the air, a shift so subtle that most people would have missed it. The hairs on the back of her neck stood at attention. Her pulse quickened. And then she heard it, the aggressive, predatory growl of an engine that didn't belong on this forgotten stretch of desert road, a sound that spoke of foreign engineering and obscene amounts of money, racing toward them with an urgency that bordered on violence. Through the large windows, high-beam headlights carved through the gathering dusk like searchlights, illuminating the interior of the diner with an intensity that made Austin's heart slam against her ribs. This wasn't the steady rumble of a truck or the sensible purr of a sedan. This was something else entirely. Something running from death or racing toward it. Marcus sat up straighter, his weathered instincts flaring. "That engine sounds wrong," he said quietly, reaching for his phone. "Real wrong." The sleek black vehicle burst into view, a luxury sedan that probably cost more than the diner had earned in its entire existence. But it wasn't the price tag that made Austin freeze, the dish towel falling from her hands. It was the smoke. Thick, black, poisonous smoke pouring from beneath the hood, and the way the car swerved violently into the parking lot, its trajectory all wrong, the driver clearly fighting for control. The sedan slammed to a stop at a harsh angle, and Austin could see flames small at first, but growing, licking out from the engine compartment. The driver's side door hung partially open, and through the haze and the failing light, she could make out a figure slumped against the steering wheel. Every survival instinct Austin had honed over 3 years of hiding screamed at her to stay inside, to duck down, to let someone else handle this. Getting involved meant being remembered. Being remembered meant being found. And being found meant the end of everything she'd worked so hard to build in this sanctuary of anonymity. But even as her mind calculated the risk, her feet were already moving. Rosa shouted something from the kitchen, her voice sharp with alarm. Marcus was on his phone, frantically trying to explain to 911 where they were located. But Austin was already out the door, the evening heat slapping her face as she ran across the asphalt toward the burning vehicle, her sensible black shoes slapping against the pavement in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. The fire was spreading fast, the first explosion just a warning shot. Austin could feel the heat radiating outward, could smell the acrid stench of burning oil and melting rubber. She reached the driver's side door and yanked it open wider, her hands moving with a confidence that came from a life she'd left behind, a life where she'd been trained to act decisively in chaos, where hesitation meant death. The man inside was barely conscious, his head rolling to the side as his eyes struggled to focus. And God, he was beautiful in a way that seemed almost obscene against the backdrop of violence and fire, sharp, aristocratic features that spoke of generations of careful breeding, skin pale from blood loss, and a body that was all lean muscle and deadly grace. But it was his torso that made Austin's breath catch. He was shirtless, and his skin was covered in the most elaborate tattoos she'd ever seen, traditional Korean dragons that coiled around his ribs, their scales rendered in such exquisite detail they seemed to move in the firelight. Peonies blooming across his shoulders in shades of crimson and black, and intricate patterns that marked him as something far more dangerous than a simple businessman. These weren't decorative tattoos. These were declarations. Warnings. Territory markers in a world Austin had promised herself she'd never touch again. His dark eyes found hers through the haze of shock, and in them, she saw something that made her heart twist, a kind of startled wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. His lips moved, forming words in Korean that she didn't understand, but his expression spoke a universal language, confusion, awe, and the dawning realization that someone was trying to save him. "I've got you," Austin said, her voice steady and commanding, the voice of the woman she used to be before she'd learned to make herself small. She reached across him, her fingers finding the seatbelt release. "But you need to help me. Can you move?" He tried to speak, coughed instead, and managed a weak nod. Austin hooked her arms under his shoulders, feeling the heat of his skin, the powerful muscles beneath, and pulled. He was heavier than he looked, all that deceptive lean strength making him a dead weight, but Austin had spent 3 years hauling cases of beer up from basement storage and carrying loaded trays through dinner rushes. She was stronger than she looked. She dragged him backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping across the pavement, leaving marks in the dust. 10 feet. 15. 20. Her shoulders screamed in protest. Her lungs burned from the smoke. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The second explosion hit like the fist of an angry god. The force of it threw Austin forward, and she instinctively curled her body over the stranger's, shielding him with her own flesh as the world erupted into chaos. The heat seared across her back, singeing the fabric of her shirt. Debris rained down around them, twisted metal, shattered glass, pieces of a car that no longer existed. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. Her vision blurred at the edges. But she didn't let go. When the world stopped spinning and the immediate danger passed, Austin lifted her head. The luxury sedan was gone, transformed into a twisted skeleton of melting metal surrounded by flames that reached toward the darkening sky like the fingers of hell made manifest. The heat was unbearable, even from 30 feet away. Beneath her, the stranger stirred. His eyes fluttered open, dark, intelligent eyes that held depths Austin instinctively knew were better left unplumbed, and he looked up at her with an expression of such raw, unguarded shock that it stole what little breath she had left. He saw her. Really saw her. Not the invisible waitress in the forgotten diner. Not the woman who'd spent 3 years making herself background noise. He saw her as she actually was, a woman who'd just pulled him from the jaws of death without hesitation, without calculation, without expecting anything in return. His hand lifted weakly, touching her cheek with fingers that trembled, his lips forming words in accented English. "Angel." "Not quite," Austin managed, her voice rough from smoke inhalation. She helped him sit up, supporting his weight as they struggled further from the inferno. "Can you stand? We need to get you inside." He nodded, leaning heavily against her, and together they stumbled toward the diner. Behind them, the flames continued their hungry consumption of what remained, casting long, dancing shadows across the parking lot that looked like demons celebrating a near-successful hunt. Austin didn't know his name. She didn't know that the elaborate dragons and peonies covering his skin marked him as Seo-jun, the head of the Beck family, one of the most powerful and feared criminal organizations in Seoul. She didn't know that the car fire was no accident, but a carefully orchestrated assassination attempt that had failed by the narrowest of margins. She didn't know that in pulling him from that wreckage, she had just bound herself to a man whose gratitude knew no limits and whose power stretched across oceans. All she knew was that he was bleeding, and she had a first aid kit in the back office. All she knew was that his eyes held something that made her chest ache, a loneliness that mirrored her own, a recognition of one exile seeing another. All she knew was that the careful, quiet life she'd built was about to shatter in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. Rosa was waiting at the door, her face pale with shock. Marcus was shouting coordinates into his phone. And somewhere in the distance, sirens began their mournful wail, still miles away but getting closer. Austin guided the stranger through the door and into a booth, easing him down as gently as she could manage. His eyes never left her face, studying her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but instead felt like being seen for the first time in 3 years. "Thank you," he whispered in that accented English, each word clearly an effort. "You saved." "Don't talk," Austin interrupted, already moving toward the first aid kit. "Save your strength. Help is coming." But even as she said it, she felt the weight of his gaze on her back, felt the shift in the air that told her that tonight had changed everything. Tomorrow, she would learn his name. Tomorrow, she would understand what those tattoos meant. Tomorrow, her carefully hidden past would collide with a present she never could have anticipated. But tonight, in this moment, all that mattered was stopping the bleeding. Tonight, Austin Sabrina was just a waitress who'd saved a stranger's life, unaware that in doing so, she'd just rewritten the entire trajectory of her future. Behind them, through the windows, the flames continued to rage against the darkening desert sky, a beacon visible for miles, a signal to those who were looking that something significant had just occurred on this forgotten stretch of Highway 87. And somewhere, unseen and unheard, decisions were being made. Calls were being placed. Resources were being mobilized. 50 private jets were being fueled and prepared, their pilots given coordinates, their passengers told to prepare for an unprecedented display of power and gratitude. But that was tomorrow's storm. Tonight belonged to fire and fate, to chance and choice, to the moment a woman who'd spent 3 years hiding decided that someone else's life was worth the risk of revealing her own. The flames were still visible through the diner windows when Austin finally got Seo-jun settled in the back booth, the one farthest from the door where the vinyl was cracked, but the view was clear. His breathing had steadied, but his skin held that clammy pallor that spoke of shock setting in, his body finally registering what his mind had been too traumatized to process, that he'd come within seconds of dying in that inferno. Rosa appeared with the first aid kit, her weathered hands shaking as she set it on the table. "Ambulance is 20 minutes out," she said, her English heavily accented with decades of Spanish that no amount of time in America could erase. "Maybe more. Roads are bad out here at night." "I know," Austin replied, already pulling out gauze and antiseptic, her movements efficient and practiced in a way that made Seo-jun's eyes narrow with interest despite his pain. She'd learned emergency first aid in another life, when she'd been someone else entirely, someone who attended charity galas and sat on hospital boards and knew how to handle a crisis with grace and competence. Old skills died hard, even when you were trying to bury them. His shirt, what remained of it, was ruined, the expensive fabric singed and torn, hanging off his shoulders in strips that revealed more of those extraordinary tattoos. Austin reached for the fabric without asking permission, because this was about survival, not modesty, and peeled it away from the burns on his shoulder and ribs. The movement made him hiss through his teeth, but he didn't pull away. Up close, the artwork on his skin was breathtaking. The dragon that coiled around his torso wasn't just ink, it was artistry, each scale individually shaded, the creature's eyes holding an intelligence that seemed almost alive in the fluorescent lights of the diner. Peonies bloomed across his shoulders and down his arms, their petals rendered in such exquisite detail that Austin could almost smell them. And beneath it all, woven through the images, were symbols she didn't recognize but instinctively understood meant something significant, something dangerous. "This is going to hurt," she warned, soaking the gauze in antiseptic. "Pain," Seo-jun said quietly, his accent thick but his English clear, "I am familiar with." She worked in silence, cleaning the burns and cuts with a gentleness that seemed to surprise him. His eyes tracked her movements, studying her face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable but instead felt oddly intimate, as if he were trying to memorize every detail, the curve of her cheek, the set of her jaw, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. "You're good at this," he observed, wincing as she cleaned a particularly nasty burn along his ribs. "Not your first time treating injuries." Austin didn't look up. "Everyone should know basic first aid." "That is not basic." He gestured to the neat bandaging she'd already completed on his shoulder. "That is professional. You have training." She did look up then, meeting his dark eyes with a steady gaze that held a warning. "I have a past. Don't we all?" Something shifted in his expression, the shock and vulnerability giving way to recognition, to understanding. He saw it because he lived it, the careful construction of a new identity, the deliberate distance from who you used to be. "Yes," he said softly. "We do." The mask he usually wore, Austin could sense it even though she'd never seen him before tonight, could feel the weight of the persona he carried like armor, was gone, stripped away by trauma and pain and the surreal intimacy of being saved by a stranger. The man sitting before her wasn't the cold, calculating figure his tattoos suggested. He was just human, vulnerable and shaken, and trying to make sense of how his life had nearly ended on a desert highway. Rosa brought coffee without being asked, setting 2 heavy ceramic mugs on the table with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The smell was rich and bitter, the kind of cheap diner coffee that tasted terrible but felt like home. Austin wrapped her hands around the warmth of her cup, suddenly aware of how cold she felt despite the lingering heat from the fire outside. Seo-jun reached for his wallet with his uninjured hand, wincing at the movement, and pulled out a black credit card that gleamed with the kind of shine that spoke of unlimited credit and exclusive bank vaults. "For your help," he said, offering it to her. "And for the coffee. And for my life. Please let me." "No." Austin pushed the card back toward him with 2 fingers, her voice firm but not unkind. "Coffee is $2. You can pay Rosa at the counter when you leave. The rest?" She met his eyes. "The rest was just being human. You don't owe me anything for that." He stared at her as if she'd spoken in a language he didn't understand, his hand still extended with the card, his expression caught between confusion and something that looked almost like wonder. "Everyone wants something," he said finally, and there was a bitterness in his voice that spoke of a lifetime of transactional relationships, of people who saw him as a means to an end rather than a person. Money, favors, connections. No one does something for nothing. Austin took a sip of her coffee, letting the bitter heat ground her. "I don't want anything from you except for you to drink that coffee before it gets cold and to stay still while we wait for the ambulance. That's it. That's the whole transaction." The silence that settled between them was different than before, heavier with unspoken questions and the fragile understanding of 2 people who'd survived something together. Outside, the fire trucks had arrived, their red lights painting the interior of the diner in alternating patterns of shadow and crimson. But inside the booth, the world had narrowed to just the two of them and the space between their coffee cups. "The isolation of power," Seo-jun said suddenly, his voice so quiet Austin almost missed it over the commotion outside. "Do you know what that feels like? To be surrounded by people and yet completely alone? To wonder if anyone would mourn the man or just the position he held." Austin thought about charity galas where she'd smiled until her face hurt, about a marriage to a man who'd valued her pedigree more than her personhood, about friends who'd vanished the moment her status changed. "Yes," she said simply. "I know exactly what that feels like." His eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, something passed between them: recognition, solidarity, the understanding of one exile seeing another clearly for the first time. "You ran from it," he observed. "From whatever that life was. You built something new here." "I built something quiet," Austin corrected. "Something small and safe where no one asks questions and everyone leaves you alone." "It's not much, but it's mine." "It's everything," Seo-jun said with a conviction that made her chest tighten. "Freedom to choose your own path. Peace. These are luxuries some of us cannot afford." They talked as the night deepened around them, sharing fragments of their lives like precious stones pulled from pockets, never the whole truth, but enough to build a mosaic of understanding. He told her about the weight of family expectations, about decisions made for him before he was born, about the constant vigilance required when everyone around you is either a potential threat or a potential asset. She told him about the freedom of anonymity, about the satisfaction of honest work, about the simple pleasure of a sunrise over the highway when the world was still asleep and anything seemed possible. The ambulance arrived as the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky, paramedics rushing in with equipment and questions. Seo-jun submitted to their examination with visible reluctance, his eyes tracking Austin as she stepped back to give them room to work. "I'll need to see you again," he said as they loaded him onto the gurney, his voice urgent. "To properly thank you." Austin shook her head, already retreating into the safety of distance. "You don't owe me anything. Go heal. Live well. That's thanks enough." But even as she said it, even as she watched the ambulance pull away with its precious cargo, she felt the shift in the air, the sense that something significant had just occurred that couldn't be undone with simple words or good intentions. She was cleaning the booth where he'd sat, trying to scrub away the bloodstains from the vinyl, when the sound of an engine cut through the early morning quiet. Not an ambulance this time, and not a fire truck. This was different, the aggressive purr of a sports car engine, flashy and intentionally loud, designed to announce its arrival and demand attention. Austin's hands froze on the dishcloth. She knew that sound. Had spent years trying to forget it, but would recognize it anywhere, in any country, in any life she tried to build. Her heart began to pound against her ribs as the cherry-red Maserati pulled into the parking lot, parking with deliberate arrogance across two spaces. The door opened and Marcus Whitfield stepped out, looking exactly as she remembered, handsome in that manufactured way that came from expensive grooming and even more expensive cosmetic dentistry. Dressed in a designer suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, his face arranged in an expression of smug satisfaction that made Austin's stomach turn. He'd found her. After 3 years of running, of hiding, of building a life so small and unremarkable that no one would think to look for her here, he'd finally found her. Marcus walked toward the diner with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his life, his eyes locked on Austin through the window with the focused intensity of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. And as he pushed open the door, bringing with him the ghost of everything she'd fled, Austin felt the walls of her carefully constructed fortress begin to crumble. "Hello, darling," Marcus said, his voice dripping with poisonous sweetness. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever in this pathetic little hovel? It's time to come home. We have unfinished business, you and I." The diner seemed to shrink around Marcus's presence, his expensive cologne suffocating the honest smell of coffee and bacon grease. Rosa had gone very still behind the counter, her instincts telling her that whatever was about to happen, she wanted no part of it. Marcus, meanwhile, stood in the center of the room like a conquering general surveying occupied territory, his eyes never leaving Austin's face. 3 years, he said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of barely controlled rage disguised as amusement. 3 years of searching, of hiring investigators, of calling in favors. Do you have any idea how much you've embarrassed me? How much explaining I've had to do about my missing fiancé? Ex-fiancé, Austin corrected, her voice steadier than she felt. I left that ring on your desk, along with a very clear letter. There's nothing between us anymore, Marcus. He laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. You don't get to make that decision unilaterally. We had an arrangement. Our families had an understanding. You don't just walk away from a Whitfield. I did walk away, Austin said, setting down the dishcloth with deliberate care. And I'm not going back. You need to leave. Marcus's handsome face twisted into something ugly, all pretense of civility evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. He moved fast, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist with bruising force. You're coming with me. Right now. I've already made arrangements. We'll be married by the end of the week, and you can spend the rest of your pathetic life making up for this humiliation. Austin tried to pull away, but his grip was iron, his fingers digging into her skin hard enough to leave marks. Let go of me. Not a chance. He started dragging her toward the door, his other hand fishing in his pocket for his car keys. You're mine, Austin. You always were. This little game of playing poor is over. Look at you, serving coffee to truckers, living in some roach-infested apartment, pretending to be nobody. You're nothing without me. Nothing without the Whitfield name. Rosa moved toward the phone, but Marcus shot her a look that froze her in place. Don't, he warned. This is a domestic matter. You really don't want to get involved. Austin struggled against his grip, her free hand reaching for the counter to anchor herself, but Marcus was stronger and angrier and accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. You're hurting me, she said through gritted teeth. Good, Marcus snarled. Maybe pain will teach you what words couldn't. You don't leave me. You don't embarrass me. And you certainly don't hide from me in some godforsaken desert. A shadow fell across them, so sudden and complete it was as if the sun had been eclipsed. Marcus's words died in his throat as a hand elegant, but radiating barely controlled violence, settled on his shoulder with deceptive gentleness. The grip looked casual to an outside observer, but the way Marcus's face immediately drained of color told a different story. I believe, a familiar accented voice said, calm and terrifyingly level, the lady asked you to let go. Seo-jun stood there, no longer the vulnerable victim from hours ago, but something else entirely, a predator in human skin, his presence filling the diner with a dangerous energy that made the air feel charged. He was still shirtless, his torso wrapped in bandages that did nothing to hide the elaborate tattoos or the lean muscle beneath. His dark eyes were cold, calculating, holding none of the vulnerability Austin had seen earlier. This was the man those tattoos advertised, the one who commanded empires and ended lives with a word. Marcus tried to wrench his shoulder free, his grip on Austin loosening just enough for her to pull away. Who the hell do you think you are? He demanded, puffing up with false bravado. This is between me and my fiancé. Mind your own business or I'll. The pressure on Marcus's shoulder increased, and he actually whimpered, his knees beginning to buckle. Seo-jun leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the entire diner. You will what? Buy this establishment? Destroy me financially? I assure you, whatever resources you think you command are insignificant compared to mine. And unlike you, I understand the value of what stands before us. He released Marcus's shoulder only to step between him and Austin, placing himself as a physical barrier. When he looked at Austin, his expression softened fractionally. Are you hurt? Austin rubbed her wrist, where Marcus's fingers had left angry red marks. I'm fine. You are not fine, Seo-jun corrected, his eyes tracking the marks with an intensity that promised retribution. He turned back to Marcus, and his voice carried a weight that made even Rosa shiver. You see a waitress. I see a queen. You see someone to own. I see someone who saved my life without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. You speak of her as if she is property. I recognize her as someone who possesses more nobility in her smallest finger than you will ever hold in your entire lineage. Marcus's face flushed red with humiliation and rage. You don't know who I am. My family owns half of. I know exactly who you are, Seo-jun interrupted, and there was something in his tone that suggested he'd already made calls, already learned everything there was to know about Marcus Whitfield in the hours since the ambulance had taken him away. You are insignificant. You are a small man with a smaller soul who mistakes cruelty for strength. And you are leaving. Now. Like hell I am, Marcus spat. Austin is coming with me, Weathersheet. Seo-jun didn't move, didn't touch him, simply pulled out his phone and snapped his fingers once. The sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot. He spoke a single phrase in Korean, his tone clipped and commanding. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From the distance came a sound that started as a low rumble, growing steadily louder and deeper until the windows began to vibrate in their frames. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't an earthquake. It was engines, many, many engines, approaching from all directions. Marcus moved to the window, his face going pale as he watched them arrive. They came like a sleek river of power, flowing along the highway from both directions, 50 private jets, their landing gear down, descending toward the small private airstrip 3 miles down the road that serviced the occasional wealthy rancher. But these weren't random aircraft. This was a coordinated display, a show of force so overwhelming that it bordered on surreal. The sky darkened with their shadows, the roar of their engines drowning out all other sound. On the highway below, black SUVs and luxury sedans began arriving in formation, creating a perimeter around the diner. Men in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, their postures professional and alert, forming a human wall that made Marcus's single sports car look like a child's toy. What the hell is this? Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. Seo-jun pocketed his phone, his expression neutral. This is what it looks like when someone I value is threatened. This is the difference between a man who demands respect and one who earns it. And this, he gestured to the overwhelming display outside, is your final warning to leave and never return. Marcus looked between the jets, the cars, the armed men, and Seo-jun's cold, implacable face. Whatever courage or entitlement he'd carried into the diner evaporated. This isn't over, he said weakly, already backing toward the door. It is, Seo-jun replied. And if you value your life, you will forget you ever knew her name. Marcus practically ran to his Maserati, the red car looking absurdly inadequate against the backdrop of military-grade displays of wealth and power. He peeled out of the parking lot, nearly clipping one of the SUVs in his panic to escape. The silence that returned to the diner was deafening. Rosa stood frozen behind the counter. Austin's legs had gone weak, and she sank into the nearest booth, trying to process what had just happened. Seo-jun turned to face her, and the mask of the powerful Mafia boss softened into something more human, more vulnerable. Forgive the dramatics, he said quietly, sliding into the booth across from her. But subtlety seemed inappropriate given his intentions. 50 jets, Austin said faintly. You called in 50 jets. I called in everything, he corrected. Because you saved my life asking for nothing, and he tried to take yours demanding everything. The mathematics seemed clear. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, not a credit card this time, but something heavier, made of matte black metal with a single embossed number. He slid it across the table with the same care someone might use when handling a loaded weapon. I will not force you to take this, Seo-jun said. I will not demand gratitude or obligation. But I want you to understand what it represents. This number connects directly to me. One call, and you have access to resources you cannot imagine. Money, yes, but also protection, freedom, the ability to build whatever life you choose without fear of men like him finding you again. Austin stared at the card, her reflection ghosting across its dark surface. I don't want your money. I know, Seo-jun said, and his slight smile held genuine warmth. That is precisely why I'm offering it. You are the first person in my life to see me without calculation, to help without agenda. Please, let me return that gift. Not as payment, but as possibility. He stood, wincing slightly at the movement, and gestured to the fleet outside. I must go. There are people who worry when I disappear, and I have much to explain. But Austin. He met her eyes. You deserve to live without fear. You deserve to build something more than small and safe. You deserve to shine. And then he was gone, disappearing into the waiting convoy, leaving Austin alone with Rosa and a card that felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hands. 6 months later, the view from the Foundation's headquarters overlooked the same desert highway where Austin had once served coffee and hidden from her past. But the woman standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows bore only a passing resemblance to that frightened waitress. Austin wore her power now with the same natural elegance she'd once hidden beneath an apron, a woman who'd learned that being small was survival, but being bold was living. The Sabrina Foundation for Women's Independence had grown faster than she'd imagined possible, funding shelters and education programs and legal services for women escaping exactly the kind of life she'd fled. She'd used Seo-jun's resources not to elevate herself, but to lift others, building a sanctuary that was anything but small. Seo-jun visited when his business brought him to the States, and sometimes when it didn't. What had begun in fire and fear had transformed into something neither of them had words for yet, a partnership built on mutual respect, on recognition, on the understanding that some rescues go both ways. Outside, the desert bloomed with spring wildflowers, painting the landscape in colors Austin had never noticed during her years of hiding. She'd been so focused on surviving that she'd forgotten to live. But now, standing in the light she'd built with her own hands and someone else's resources, watching the highway stretch toward a horizon full of possibility, Austin finally understood what Seo-jun had tried to tell her. She'd never been nothing. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to remember she was everything.